have the presidential primaries for 2024 started yet, or does that actually start in 2024?
Oh, I think they've basically started.
Yeah.
We've got a few people announcing candidacies, and some of the main folks are playing it a bit coy still, but it's obvious that they're going to run. I think if I understand it correctly, Joe Biden has officially announced that he's going to seek re-election. I think it's going to be a tough one to watch. It's going to be gruesome this year. It's just there are no good choices and no exciting candidates, and
Yeah.
and nobody's you know nobody's really focusing on any issues that seem to really strike at the heart of concerns that most people have these days. There's a lot of you know distraction on wedge issues and you know culture war kind of topics, and the real concerns, economy and jobs. And for me, I'm interested obviously in technology and that sort of thing. The candidates are just kind of all unexciting and uninspiring all around. So it's we'll see what happens, but it's I mean, maybe Joe Biden will succeed in getting reelected. Maybe Trump will get uh, another term. Who knows? It's too early to tell, but yeah, I don't see myself getting particularly excited about this election season.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a strong sense of foreboding.
Yeah, it's I just don't see anybody worth getting hopeful about, um, or even really honestly injecting any new ideas into the political discourse. And one of the things that was fun about the last election was that you had, they weren't you had individuals like Andrew Yang,
Right.
who was never going to win uh, at all. I mean, he didn't have a snowball's chance in hell, obviously, of winning the nomination for the Democratic Party, let alone the election. But he brought a very interesting new set of ideas to the table and got surprisingly good traction with some of them, and including his centerpiece, of course, which was universal basic income, a small one, a modest one, but nevertheless,
Mm.
he put that on the table, and that was very interesting. It was a breath of fresh air. I don't know if we've got anything comparable this time around. I don't think we've got any exciting new candidates that fill anybody with hope. So it's just yeah, all rather unexciting and uninspiring this time around.
Yeah, one of the things I find, I think it's quite unique and very idiomatic about American politics is the way in which these kind of odd candidates, not to use a pejorative, but sort of odd candidates, use the presidential election as a kind of platform to raise awareness of an issue. I mean, not to say that that's, I mean, Andrew Yang was serious, right? I mean, he was really putting a lot of money and time and effort and his own social capital into running. So it's not like it was purely a marketing campaign for these ideas, but I guess he viewed it as a positive side effect, given the very low chances of him winning, that he did actually move the needle on public awareness on some of these issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think one of the great ironies um, is that Donald Trump almost certainly did not expect to win
Mm. Mm.
the election in 2016. I think that came as big of a shock to him as really to anybody else. That he was like, "Oh my God, this is actually happening! I can't believe I'm winning." A sort of situation. I think for him, his original plan, if he had one at all, was just drumming up, interest and notoriety around his brand and his personal identity, because that was very much his sort of modus operandi throughout his entire career, leading up to that point. And I I don't think I mean, it really wasn't ever his intention, as far as I can tell, to genuinely win the presidency and then be an effective president. That was never, I think he was hoping to run, lose, and then complain, use the notoriety and the attention and complain bitterly about the loss
Mm.
to just further his celebrity. and his career as a celebrity, basically. And it didn't quite work out that way, unfortunately for all of us. But that seems to be quite a common pattern. And California's gubernatorial races, the elections for governor in California, are full of crazy characters, old washed up actors, nut jobs, all sorts of goofballs that are using the election as very much as you said to bring attention to themselves or to some cause or set of ideas or ideology, that sort of thing. And I mean, this is a fairly widespread pattern in, I think, in politics and democracies globally, because there's more participation in democracy, in other words, in elections and races, than would otherwise be rational. I mean, you wouldn't see as many candidates in most races if they were genuinely rational and they were only committing the time and spending the resources and so forth, based on a reasonable evaluation of their chances of winning, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there are lots of cases where you're not going to win. Obviously, you're not going to win. The Green Party's not going to win the presidential election in the United States. The Transhumanist Party is not going to win. Their candidate is going nowhere in the race. But that's not the point. The point is not to win. The point is to run the race, and there's a victory just in being a successful participant in the process, I suppose. And I think that that's something that characterizes these sorts of systems, and maybe even broader than just democracy itself. I mean, we could try to connect this as a general principle, maybe a game theoretic principle. What is the value of participation, even knowing you can't win? What is the value of participating in a marketplace of various different kinds, in a marketplace of ideas, in a marketplace of producing goods and services, in a marketplace of fame and notoriety, in a marketplace of influence and power and information and communications and building network effects that you can leverage later? What is the logic of investing now as a participant in order to accrue benefits later? Is it good to run and participate and lose now for future gains of various kinds? I mean, including experience that might let you win in a future race. There's a lot of fascinating sort of game theoretic style dynamics here that you could unpack and then look for applications to the topic we're here to discuss, which is the artificial intelligence race. And what is the logic behind participating? If you know you can't, if you know really you're very unlikely to win, there are still good reasons for participating, for running in the race. And then of course there are different kinds of victories, right? There are what is it? Forgive me, I only read the word Pyrrhic or Pyrrhic victories.
Pyrrhic, yeah.
Where, I mean, maybe you can't win, but you can force somebody else to lose, to not win. You can take victory away from somebody else, and maybe that's a triumph. Maybe that is its own victory, in a way. And sabotaging the chances of another candidate is certainly a plausible, again, game theoretic kind of strategy. So there are definitely things to think about in arms races and competitive processes that generalize, across systems of all kinds, including this new ecosystem, competitive ecosystem emerging around artificial intelligence.
Before we go there, I want to touch on an interesting analogy that occurred to me when you were speaking about Trump competing in the election. Have you read Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality? Eliezer Yudkowsky's, I would say, famous fan fiction.
I actually have not read that. I've heard of it, but I haven't read that.
Yeah, so I read it over the last week. Well, I skipped some parts of it, but I found other parts quite interesting. I'll paraphrase the role of Voldemort there. So in that alternative telling of the Harry Potter story, Voldemort arises because, somehow Voldemort starts off as a character, in the sense that the actual person in the story is planning to take over the world, but in order to practice, decides to put up first a kind of cartoon villain, like play the role of a stupid cartoon villain who can't possibly win because they're just too evil and they're not going to be able to attract enough allies or whatever. But he'll get his mistakes out of the way by being Voldemort first, and then he's Voldemort playing Voldemort. But then finds out that the opposition is so incompetent, the Ministry of Magic is so useless, that he seems to be winning. And in the end, he comes within a hair's breadth of actually defeating all the good guys because they're all so disunified and incompetent. And as soon as he just outwits them without even trying. So he's really not trying to win, but he actually ends up winning. And given the comparisons that the left wing in the US make between Trump and Voldemort, I think it's quite hilarious that there's a fan fiction already existing in which basically it's kind of exactly the way that Trump ended up winning. So I thought that was amusing.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we, I think, probably see quite a few examples of in competitive situations in the context of technology disruption, where we see a lot of own goals that kind of doom either aspiring upstarts or incumbents that, you know, have a golden opportunity to transition or transform themselves or reinvent themselves around a new technology, but for a variety of reasons, sometimes just comical incompetence, sometimes just bad luck, bad timing, they fail spectacularly in a way that makes for pretty good drama, I think. And one example that very much comes to mind, it's sort of a textbook example, but there is some good drama and comedy embedded in the details of the story, is Kodak's demise as a consequence of the first digital camera disruption, the digital imaging, digital photography technology disruption. Kodak actually owned and developed, well, they invented a number of the key technologies behind digital imaging. They had several key patents related to the CCD sensors and a number of other elements that, you know, in principle, should have positioned themselves perfectly for not necessarily saving the traditional photography industry. That wasn't going to happen, but at least for reinventing themselves and building a new product line and expanding their empire based on this new technology. So it was theirs to lose, and they just absolutely, just totally fumbled at every step, botched everything, the timing, and underestimated everything, and became of course now a textbook case of what not to do when you're facing the obvious disruption by a new technology as an incumbent. So there are examples of these terrible own goals where, you know, the odds-on favorites, it's just theirs to lose. And it does happen. You know, it happened to Hillary Clinton, to Donald Trump, of course. And Kodak's another good example. And there are many others across a variety of domains, obviously, competitive domains of all kinds. I'm sure, I mean, athletics and sports and stuff are just filled with countless examples of literal own goals and then figurative ones where the favorites lost to the underdogs. And of course, we love an underdog story somehow as well, right? So these are somehow innately appealing victories. There's something about human nature and our evolved psychology that makes us perhaps take satisfaction in seeing an underdog triumph over the odds-on favorite. But it does happen often enough that it's a meme, it's a stereotype.
Google versus OpenAI, perhaps. Okay. What should we discuss today? I guess you touched on a couple of things there already. Is there anything in particular you want to start with, Adam?
Well, one of the things that we mentioned offline of this conversation that I wouldn't mind picking up on and kind of doing a general discussion around is I'm still trying to gain a better understanding of where the power is really going to lie in these new technologies, at least for in the near future. I know that the more distant future is much less foreseeable. But one of the things I'm trying to understand is where just based on the nature of the technology itself, where does power and control lie? Where is it likely to accrue? What can be open sourced and decentralized and diffused broadly across large communities versus what is only going to be possible with very expensive, very costly, centralized assets that are owned by either big corporations or governments, or consortiums or something like that. And specifically, the things that I'm still not as clear as I would like to be about are what does it take to train these big systems now, and what are we imagining is training going to look like going forward, or are we still going to see incentives to continue scaling to larger models that will have larger training requirements? That's the initial training or pre-training or both. Then there is the ongoing retraining and sort of upskilling or learning that the models themselves do. I don't know very much about those processes or what the frontiers of development look like there. I've seen a number of papers. I don't pretend to understand them at all, of course. I'm sure you guys do, that talk about the challenges and the opportunities and some of the recent breakthroughs in basically giving these models, these large token prediction models, more memory and the ability to onboard new information on a semi-permanent or permanent basis, as opposed to just the context window of a given quote unquote conversation, as it were. Then beyond that, you have the actual instancing of the agent, or the access to the model, I suppose, if it's sort of via, and by an agent I mean sort of an instance of the running model that a user can interact with or take advantage of. So I'm thinking here, the either what you get as a service when you access a model like GPT-4 through an API or through a terminal like ChatGPT, and what differences are there between accessing one instance and running the model via the compute that is being provided remotely? In other words, to use ChatGPT as an example, you're accessing that tool, but you're at a dumb terminal and it's being driven by compute resources, by hardware elsewhere, versus local hardware that's running models locally. And the value, the utility, the capacities that are there, will those continue to scale? Is local hardware, in other words, our personal computers, are they still improving at a pace that, price performance pace that is likely to keep up with improvements in these models? Or are you simply not going to be able to run a model that's anything like the state of the art on your own machine for now or for much longer, for example? I'm trying to understand that. And then lastly, sorry, I know this is a big laundry list, and lastly, is there any additional value in running large numbers, large assemblies or constellations or armies of instances of the model that you're talking about? And do emergent capabilities appear when you wire up many instances of these models? So if you can spin up 100 or 1,000 instances of the GPT-4 model and get them all interacting and recursively feeding back into one another, and all benefiting not only from plugins but from the effects of being a network, is that something that produces enough additional capability that it's a service or it is a benefit that can only accrue to those with the resources to have hundreds or thousands of these instances running? And that seems to be right now, that is not something you're going to do on your on your laptop. So that's my broad, sort of field domain of question is what does all this look like together? And then does that shed light on where we're likely to see power and control emerging over time here? And I should say, just finally for context, my motivation for asking all of this is the hope that there might be some potential, some scope for outsourcing, crowdsourcing, decentralizing, open sourcing all of these marvelous new tools. Because if there really is no way to gain anything close to the cutting edge state of the art benefits of these systems without basically having access to a supercomputer, well, only people with access to a supercomputer are gonna avail themselves of all of those benefits. And that is a less ideal outcome than one in which, well, it takes a lot of money and a lot of resources to train these systems, but once they're trained, it's pretty much equal. In the same way that it takes a lot of money and resources to set up a factory that manufactures cars or that manufactures, automatic rifles. But once they're making them, well, almost anybody can buy a car, and almost anybody can buy a rifle and avail themselves of the power, the equalizing power of those technologies, which we discussed last time. I mentioned those as examples last time of those technologies being great equalizers. But if that's not the case here, then we're looking at something that's much more like nuclear weapons or, fighter jets or something that no, the average person in the street is not going to own their own, nuclear missile or fighter jet that then is going to level the playing field with all other assemblages or instances of power around them. So that's my motivation for asking all of this.
Yeah, maybe it occurs to me I don't really agree with the analogies you're making there at the end. You're describing it as a choice between an AI that's sort of maybe in your pocket, like the way a phone is, or maybe in your house as like a PC, or versus some sort of artifact that you take away and it's yours. But I think I would see AI as being more like wheat. I think it's more like a commodity. And you can see in the commodities market that just because you grow a lot of wheat doesn't mean you derive a lot of power from having, growing wheat. It's not like farmers there's a secret cabal of farmers that seem to run the world. No, we talk about secret cabals of financiers and capitalists running the world, because those are the ones that direct the flow of the commodity and control the markets and futures and other derivatives that dictate, how those commodities are accessed. I don't think it's necessarily the case in my mental model that. So I guess my thinking is that at the moment there's different flavors of these models, right? And we kind of think of GPT-4 as being different to Claude, as being different to Bard, as being slightly different to whatever thing is running Bing's chatbot. And that's true to an extent because the training sets are different and the alchemical recipe is a bit different. But I think it's more like a commodity. I think as the market settles, it'll just be pretty indistinguishable. Maybe at the cutting edge there's differences, but you can already see this happening at the lower end, right? With sort of models around the 10 billion parameters or less. It's pretty quickly going to converge to more or less a homogeneous commodity. And maybe there's even, I'm sort of interested in what competitive pressures would push it more in the direction of a commodity, where you sort of, you have a standardized training set. The pile is sort of starting to play that role, or Common Crawl and some other data sets. You have standardized data sets, standardized RLHF data sets, and basically it becomes, there's a standard, just like there are standards for different varieties of oil, if I understand correctly, or other commodities. And there's a lot of virtue to having that standard, because then from both sides, from the producer side and the consumer side. There's a lot of certainty, and you can sort of build on top of that to establish things like commodities markets. If that's the way it moves, then there's almost no power to being the producer, right? You're just participating in a commodity market. Now, I guess that doesn't quite make sense because somebody has to serve it from a data center somewhere. It's not a commodity like wheat that you can ship around and then have in your silo. But at the same time, commodities markets, when they started in, if I understand correctly, with CBOT, if that's the right acronym, in Chicago, with, I think it was wheat. Well, if you're trading futures in wheat, you also don't know exactly where your wheat is, and you don't care, right? There's just some providers of that service that have the silos somewhere, and who cares? It's not relevant really to either the producers or the consumers. Somebody picks the wheat up from your doorstep if you're a farmer, and somebody delivers it to your doorstep if you're the consumer, and that's kind of part of the market itself. I can imagine just in the same way that the silos for intelligence, they're in some data center somewhere. You know, you buy your, whatever, 10 million tokens on the spot market for tokens. I mean, prediction tokens, not training tokens. So, and then you cash that out somewhere, and everybody's competing for that. The signal goes over the internet and you get back your prediction. Do you care which particular server the prediction was made in? I don't think so. I think it could work out pretty much analogous to other commodity markets. That's, I think, what I would predict, at least for the trailing edge capabilities. Maybe at the leading edge there's still some kind of, what's the right word? Distinction.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like you're maybe talking about at least two categories of capability. Maybe it's a continuum, but the two that you mentioned were sort of the leading edge and the trailing edge, or the trailing bulk of you sort of had the leading edge of the herd, the front runners, or the outliers, or the exposed pioneers at the frontier, or whatever kind of a metaphor you want to pick. And then you've got sort of the bulk of the herd, and then you've got some number trailing behind. But let's say we've got a couple of categories there at least. One sounds to me plausibly that it's that's fairly fungible. So commoditization makes some sense there. Like, if it's really just about predicting tokens and there was not much marginal difference between one token and the next, then if you've got 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or a million, it's a little bit like what you can buy with money. And money's sort of, as currency, is deliberately maximally fungible, but there are other commodities that are pretty fungible. That can be, it can be exchanged for other things, fairly straightforward and forwardly. And 1 kilogram of sugar is about as good as another kilogram of sugar, and same for salt and other commodities and so on and so forth. But it sounds like you've got another bucket there, which is at the leading edge. Maybe there's something more emergent, some other capability. There might be something that you can't purchase one unit at a time. And that's where the analogy with, and perhaps the property of commoditization fails. Because with something like sugar or salt, there isn't some sort of critical mass that materializes and suddenly you have something completely different. Maybe that's not true. Maybe with enough salt you could build some structure or some I don't know. You could build Superman's Fortress of Solitude. My understanding is that the original set for the original film in the 1970s, it's supposed to be ice and crystals and stuff, is built out of salt, for example. So, maybe that's something that emerges if you get enough damn salt in one place. But it sounds like maybe there's a suspicion that at some level there are things that you can do with enough intelligence that there's some sort of tipping point or some threshold effect that's there. And those are the sorts of things that I would be keen to understand. It would be great to anticipate what those might be. But I think you're right. I think in the main, we can expect a fair amount of intelligence, at least as we think of it at the human level, as being fairly commoditized, because we already see labor markets that are fairly commoditized. Labor markets in which human level intelligence is the capability that's being leveraged. And again, I'm speaking not just about knowledge workers who are sitting in office cubicles, but human intelligence is the reason why you can drive a car, or why you can mow a lawn, or why you can work retail or in a restaurant or anything else. All of that is, as we've learned the hard way, is requires a huge amount of intelligence. Instantiated, embodied actions in complex dynamic environments require a lot of intelligence. Those things were not at all as the low-hanging fruit we imagine they might be, at the beginning of the computer era in the 1950s and 60s, hence the long AI winter. And so I agree. I think that there's almost certainly scope for intelligence as a service to be highly commoditized, and perhaps tokens are the unit or the currency or the metric to think about there. But having said that, we can also see from the examples of human intelligence that there are breakthroughs. There are critical masses of the right kind of intelligence that comes together in the right way that then produces things that are genuinely emergent, right? And that is a completely different category of value creation, let's say. And any entity that owns and controls that will, I think, we can say with high confidence, they will accrue immense benefit and therefore enjoy immense power. And through human history up until now, especially over the last sort of 150 years or so, the centers of wealth and power that have coincided with the production of useful knowledge, in other words, with technological and scientific breakthroughs that have proved leverageable economically and socially, those have translated into massive power centers. And the United States and certain parts of the United States are still centers of power in that sense, 100 plus years on. So if we see that same pattern, then if we have sort of a hard takeoff FOOM kind of scenario where suddenly, super intelligence, whether it's agentic and sentient or not, is producing breakthroughs like MIT, but 100 or 1,000 times faster. Whoever controls that system is going to enjoy a very privileged position of power, I think. So that's my general response, that there are at least two categories. Maybe there's a smoother gradient with a continuum with multiple other buckets in there somewhere, but I think we've got at least two there. Now, certainly not one, and it's all commoditizable. There's definitely something special at the frontier or the high end, as it were.
Yeah, it's certainly true that you can't ask wheat to help direct the activity of other wheat.
Yeah, the recursion isn't there in the wheat domain.
Go ahead, Matt.
I don't know. I mean, maybe if you stack wheat high enough in a silo, it starts to ferment itself at the very bottom and turn itself into beer or something. I don't know.
About so the two layers that you're talking about, the commodity intelligent systems and the is it that they're more intelligent at the top, or that they're harder to replicate because they're kind of some mix of experiences and training data and tuning that makes them way more useful? what is it about the top things that makes them not a commodity?
Yeah, I think Adam and I are sort of slightly on different pages, I think. So let me clarify. So when I was talking about trailing edge and leading edge, it was mostly just a description of the current landscape and extrapolating a little bit, where the trailing edge, the open source attempts or the reproductions of GPT-like systems by smaller organizations, by necessity, they use more standardized pieces, right? So they're taking more off-the-shelf training sets, more off-the-shelf, both for the pre-training and for RLHF, more off-the-shelf and public information for how to perform the various pieces, and they have an incentive to standardize that. And you can see that leading sort of in obvious ways and sort of strategic reasons to a fairly standardized procedure for producing any one of these artifacts. Whereas on the leading edge, obviously, you have the opposite incentive, which is OpenAI has no incentive at all to explain how they produce GPT-4. They would rather derive lots of benefits from having the cutting edge system for as long as possible. And so by its nature, it won't be standardized at the leading edge. The companies that have poured billions of dollars into training those systems will do different things because there's secret knowledge involved. And so those systems will not be they'll have similar capabilities perhaps, but they won't be completely fungible in the sense that one token of prediction for an OpenAI on their leading edge model is the same as getting, in terms of performance or other less easily described characteristics, won't be exactly the same as getting a prediction from Anthropic's latest model, for instance. I think what Adam's getting at is more deconstructing the idea of a commodity itself, I think, rather than contrasting these two things. Because I don't think there's any obstacle to taking these trailing edge, more standardized GPTs and putting a bunch of them together and getting them to generate some emergent capability. So I think that's going more in the direction of it's not exactly a commodity. Suppose that oil, given kind of oil, suppose it every few months people discovered new uses for it. Well, that is kind of true. It was true for some time, but that you found ways of using oil on itself or something. So it's not just that people discover new forms of plastics or whatever that you can derive from oil. But that's not exactly at the point of purchase, or it's not sort of an issue to do with how you produce or can purchase it. So I think it's a little bit separate from whether it's a commodity or not. But obviously the leading edge is going to be more capable of being deployed in this direction of combining them together and so on. So and the exponentials at play may mean that the prediction tokens are not equally valuable, right? Because depending how fast the leading edge advances and how quickly people can put together the confederations of open source initiatives to produce the intelligence at the trailing edge, 100 tokens at the leading edge could be worth 1 million tokens at the trailing edge in terms of actual outcomes, right? So that's not a characteristic of most commodities, that they sort of divide up in buckets like that, where some buckets have transformative capabilities and others are just kind of do my homework for me level capabilities.
Yeah, intelligence is sort of a general purpose, problem solving, solution finding, path seeking, navigating, pattern recognizing technology. It's this extraordinarily agile tool, right? And so it's you have to cast the net pretty wide to find sort of useful analogs or parallels for that kind of tool. You mentioned oil, also, historically quite extraordinary for the diversity of its applications, but it's not quite in that league. Electricity, also pretty extraordinarily broad in terms of its potential applications, but maybe not quite in that league. It's more like something along the lines of language or maybe money.
Yeah, I was going to say
Money
capital.
itself is interesting, yeah, or capital, yeah, maybe more, even more. But so if you let's think about the parallels with money for a second. Like money, what can money buy you? I mean, it's so versatile, and of course by design. I mean, it's its function. That's its function. But if you have if you have a little bit of money, you can you can solve all kinds of problems with money. But if you only have a little bit, not much is within your reach as far as causal power to create the sorts of transformations of the world that you desire. If you have a huge amount of money, you can solve big problems and change the world in big ways according to your values and goals and so forth. If you're a billionaire, you can muster an army to achieve extraordinary goals. And unfortunately, that seems fairly rare, but once in a while we do see things to that effect. And I wonder if it's something, again, analogous here, where, I mean, maybe it's not even analogous. Maybe money is kind of literally the same thing. I mean, you can buy human labor. I mean, if you can hire people, and of course that's what we do. And individuals can hire other individuals. And if you have a small job, if you need the 10 units worth of human brain power for something, or human brow sweat, as it were, if you need manual labor or something like that, you can purchase that as an individual. You can hire people to help you on an individual basis. You can get more organized than that if you have more money, and you can form a company, and you can dedicate people with specific skills to a specific set of tasks and the pursuit of specific goals. If you have a huge amount of money, you can build big companies, big organizations, perhaps more than one organization, with thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals. And so that's like instances of intelligence and capability. And so then again, where there are big risks of thinking by analogy with human beings here. I mean, we need to be wary about that. But certainly when we look to human labor markets, that's probably pretty instructive. And there is a sense in which human labor is quite commoditized. And then at the rarefied extreme, there are instances where you can't hire your way into truly genius breakthroughs. I mean, 1,000 people with an IQ of 100 will not achieve breakthroughs that one person with an IQ of 200 can. And it's, no amount of chimpanzees is thrown at a problem is going to solve it the way that the way that a human being can solve them effortlessly. And it could be, of course, and again, we risk reasoning by analogy here, but it could, of course, be the same for artificially intelligent systems. And it could also be just a matter of scaling, as long as the right kind of networking and interconnection, the right architecture exists to allow emergent capabilities to arise. So it could be that if you can instance, 2 million of these human level intelligences, if you have enough resources to instance giant numbers of them, and you network them all together with just the right architecture, you can get super intelligent outcomes. You can literally put up, millions of 100 IQ bots together, and they will form a 200 IQ entity. Maybe that's possible in a way that it just isn't with human beings, because we just can't network together in the same sort of way. But I don't know. If you want to solve a problem that it takes absolutely brilliant people to solve, what do? Well, you can't just hire more bodies from the mass pool of commoditized labor and expect to get the result you want. That's not something we see in the human realm. But maybe that is something that could emerge with these new tech. You guys tell me. I mean, I don't know. It kind of got my head. Kind of really got into my head, Dan, when you were talking about, well, just spin up a bunch of these instances and have all these bots and have them talk to each other for the equivalent of hundreds and hundreds of hours or years or whatever, while they're digesting some massive back catalog of data that some company like McKinsey has, and maybe amazing things will emerge out of that. I mean, that seems sort of plausible to me, but it also seems quite self-evident that you're only going to be able to do that if you have the kind of money that McKinsey has to throw around, and you're not going to be able to do that if you work at McDonald's, even if in principle you have a laptop computer that you can run an instance of GPT-4 on, even a free one that's available online. So I'm very concerned about power concentration still possessing huge advantages.
Yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead.
How does this interact with your concept of superpower from the energy disruption stuff? So if, for example, one of the main bottlenecks on, once you have trained the AI model, the running it, a million clones of it in parallel, one of the main bottlenecks is just the energy resources that are required to perform that computation. There's also the hardware resources, but it seems like energy is like a big one. And if you are in a regime where there's abundance of energy, then do you think that would have some kind of equalizing effect?
Yeah, I was actually just talking with some of the researchers on my team about this. I think there are definitely some interesting synergies there with near zero marginal cost electricity. And there are both synergies between the two technologies, and then there are parallels between the two technologies. So the parallels are that a lot of it is capital upfront cost. I mean, that's most of your expense is acquiring the equipment. I guess with these models, even in the software, the expense is in doing the training, and then it's much less expensive. The marginal cost is much lower, near zero, perhaps, if under some circumstances, for running the system. It's very similar to solar power or batteries, for example. The cost is all up front. You're not shoveling fuel into them as you go. They don't take a huge army of people to maintain or to guard. So nuclear power plants, for example, they're very expensive to build, but they're also super expensive to operate because you need a literal army of people with machine guns around them to protect them, and then you need a figurative army of technicians inside to keep them running safely. It's hugely expensive upfront and on an ongoing basis. With solar panels, you just build them, and then forever after, or certainly for 40 or 50 years, they just sit there and happily make electricity, and so the marginal cost is very, very close to zero. Now, there are certainly some analogies, some parallels there with that and compute. So the internet is in its infrastructure. Is very much like that. You build all this equipment, you build the infrastructure, and then the actual cost on a per bit or byte basis, cost of moving information around, copies of information, all those sorts of things, communications, those costs are near zero. They're very, very, very low. The cost is mostly upfront in the capital. So there are a lot of parallels there. Where the synergies emerge, those are pretty cool too. Like if you have all of this near zero marginal cost clean electricity, and you have it for a big chunk of the year because you've sized the system for the winter, and then in the summer it's sort of supersized, it's overproducing, as it were. And that's where our team's concept of superpower emerged. Well, then you've got a sort of a condition of energy abundance in a way, and one of the applications could be running your computing equipment. Another interesting thing to think about is that, especially if you could move superpower around from one region to another, so if you had transmission capability, or if you had energy storage capability of the right kind, and not just electrochemical and batteries, but also thermal storage, for example, then you could utilize superpower to power computation, or that's one thing to think about, or you could kill two birds with one stone, and you could do the computation and then use that as a heating function. So it's kind of funny, but like a space heater, if you buy an electric heater, the heater's doing computation. It's just useless computation, at least from our perspective. It's not doing any kind of information processing that's useful to us. But you could buy a computer with the same wattage, and it would be just as effective as a space heater in your house. But then it might also do some useful computation for you, right? It might do some useful information processing. And so
actually used my computer to do that.
So there's some potential for some synergies there. We'll see. I mean, there's some mismatches too. Like you don't typically need heating when you need when you have superpower, because most of it comes from the sun. But there are windy places where there's a lot of superpower in the winter. It's rarer, but there are a few places that are like that. So yeah, it's interesting to think about where the parallels are, and then where also the synergies are between these two technologies. But I think that they are united by this unintuitive property, which is once they're built, running them is not nearly as expensive as the setting them up to begin with. And then they have the potential to continue producing benefits for a very long period of time, at relatively low unit cost. In other words, at very low marginal cost. And that is again, a very different kind of economics that's not familiar to us. It's an economics based on stocks where the flows are very, very low cost, and that's unintuitive. Information and communications is now like that and has been for about 25 years, but that was genuinely something new under the sun, in human experience. Most of the rest of of things in our lives are not like that, and certainly in our ancestral environment, almost everything was a flow and nothing was a stock, and you were desperately trying to take advantage of flows when they arose and where they were. Kind of literally out of the river in some instances, of course. And it was not at all a situation where you invested heavily and you built up stocks, and then those stocks just sort of delivered from then on. And the one exception to that I can think of historically, which was a monumental shift in the human condition from our ancestral condition, was agriculture. We finally realized you can go to the upfront effort to plant things, especially trees, and then they will just continue to deliver. Now, not always when you want. The flow is intermittent and slow, but you will get fruit if you plant a tree. And that was totally different than our ancestral condition, the one that our brains certainly involved in, and to find intuitive. So yeah, we've got this weird situation now where marginal costs are not the limiting factor. It's the capital costs that are. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, and I kind of waffling a bit here, but it's definitely something that my team is trying to get a handle on. We're trying to figure out the right way to frame and think about AI and whether or not it is is it a commodity? Can it be a service? Is it near zero marginal cost, or is it high marginal cost? Are there historical analogs in other businesses or the business models that will translate, or is this something again, something new under the sun that we've never seen before, that breaks all of the rules, including all of our framework about technology disruptions? We don't know the answers to those things yet. We've been struggling mightily for 6 months to find them, and we haven't found satisfactory answers yet. So
if you put it this way, you said sort of this distinction between the cost and then the marginal costs. It's because you're putting a lot of effort into training, and then you get to a point where you don't have to train anymore, and you just run and then the inference compute is like a tiny fraction of the training compute for each each token you predict or each sort of intelligent output that you want more broadly. So I wonder. So there's like a loose analogy, obviously, between these systems and individual people. So, but there's like a you don't, when you're a person, you don't just like train for the first 6 months of your life and then run on inference mode. You're obviously continually learning, and I think maybe in the future these systems will be in like a continual learning mode where from each this is like a half thought that I'm like thinking as I say it, but you're kind of training as you are also using these models, and so I wonder if that complicates things. It's like there's sort of the fixed costs are kind of ongoing, even if the marginal costs are of using it, like you're using it as you're also still training it. Like it's not a two-stage process. It's like an integrated process. I wonder if that would change anything in your calculations.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could. It certainly could. I suppose it also depends on the benefits that arise from that ongoing training and ongoing development. I mean, tragically, I think we do see this in, throughout history, of course, and then still today in far too many societies around the world, and disadvantaged communities and impoverished communities, even in the wealthier countries like the United States, where development of individuals, of human beings, is arrested, and it is a tragedy. People do stop developing when and not because they have lack the potential to continue developing, but because they lack the opportunities and the means to do so, and the resources, because continuing to develop your capabilities is expensive, and it's a luxury if there's a high opportunity cost there. If you you have to be privileged enough to be able to go to university and get training, and not have to be pulling weeds or picking fruit in the fields to pay your way and to put food on the table, kind of thing. So I think we see this in human beings where yes, development does continue, but tragically, often, and I think in too many cases, it doesn't continue enough. But certainly with machines, I mean, one could imagine, again, this condition of commoditization where the capabilities are just good enough for what you might reasonably want an instance of artificial intelligence to do for you. And I can imagine fairly quickly reaching a state where the bots are just smart enough, and maybe you don't want them to become any more capable. I mean, I can see this especially with embodied intelligences, where maybe you don't want the bots to continue getting smarter and smarter. Maybe you want to limit that, and cutting off the training and having them not develop is maybe one path to that. But so that's one scenario, just on the flip side of things. But I can certainly see what you're suggesting, obviously, which is that if capabilities continue to emerge with ongoing training and development of an artificial intelligence of some sort, even one that isn't sentient, even one that isn't agentic, even if it's just learning more and more about you and your history and continuing to become better at adding value to your life. I'm trying to avoid words like service and serving you and meeting your needs and whatnot. Trying to avoid, painting a picture of enslavement. But I mean, certainly I can see, if value were to continue to emerge out of investing in a bot's development, well, yeah, I mean, it would cost, that would have a cost, and the competitive dynamics, the market dynamics, basically economics, would continue to function on the basis of scarcity and need, and unfulfilled desires, that all of those same dynamics would continue to apply, and so you wouldn't have a sort of superpower analogous. You wouldn't have a near zero marginal cost condition of superabundance. We wouldn't have an abundant condition. You'd have a scarcity condition, and you guys tell me. I mean, where do we reach those different points, and what is likely to continue to emerge here in terms of capability? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Maybe I can comment on your earlier question about sort of constellations of GPTs talking to each other. I don't know what OpenAI is doing right now, but if I were them, this is what I would be doing. It isn't. So it's clear we will continue to get benefits by scaling, but depending on, it is getting expensive, and there isn't so many more training tokens you can find by just going out on the internet. So if I think about what I would do in their position, well, we know a way of generating useful tokens, which is reinforcement learning, right? So in reinforcement learning, if you're trying to perform a task, you're basically generating your own training data by watching yourself attempt the task and seeing what works to what degree and what doesn't. So you don't need to have pre-existing training tokens if you're doing reinforcement learning, as long as you're playing a game which has a score, you have some other kind of reward function. Okay, so that's maybe a source of tokens. Well, Gato from DeepMind is for example, being trained at least in part that way. Okay, so that's a source of tokens. You'd also like to make use of the existing capabilities that you have. So you have GPT-4, it's trained, it's sitting there, as you say, it's extremely cheap, relatively speaking, to run in inference mode, much cheaper inside the intelligence industrial complex of OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and so on than it is outside. We have to pay per token, but from their point of view, it's effectively free, or at least there's only the opportunity cost of what they could make selling those tokens rather than using them themselves. Okay, so if you have effectively free inference for a very capable model, and you think that getting to the next level of capability maybe comes from reinforcement learning, then a very obvious thing to do is to have a system, let's call it GPT squared, that looks something like this, right? Where you have the thing you're training, this has some parameters theta, and what it's doing is it's taking a collection of first order GPTs, so these are like GPT-4, they're parameterized in some way, perhaps by their prompt, right? So you think of these as workers inside a company, and they're given roles, and the roles are specified as they are for humans in a contract, as a prompt, as communications from the manager. This is kind of a manager. And you're not actually, so the GPT-4, which is this thing, right, is not changing its parameters, or at least not very much. Maybe it's fine-tuned slightly, but mostly it's just modifying prompts, so you're making use of in-context learning. And these first-order GPTs are communicating. This is the kind of communication that you're talking about, Adam. And this communication is mediated by this controller. Maybe that's a better word. More Kubernetic. Okay, so this is sort of running this process, right? And it receives tasks. So you have to have some tasks in the world whose performance you can measure, but maybe this is also coming from people to some extent. You receive tasks, the controller's job, and this is actually a reasonably large model that's actively being trained by this reinforcement learning loop. It receives tasks. Its job is to figure out how to disaggregate the tasks and direct individual components to appropriate workers, to give them instructions, to supervise the communication between them and make sure it doesn't go off track, to prompt the individual agents to sort of overcome their limitations and stop going off on down rabbit holes and so on, much as a real human manager would do. And then the result comes out of this. So that's the kind of result. You could train that by reinforcement learning in principle. I don't know if it's in practice going to work, but you could imagine this as being a fairly cost-effective way of making use of a very large amount of the raw capability of GPT-4 that is just sitting in the data center, and you just train this controller. So that's kind of in the direction of what people are doing with things like AutoGPT, but they don't have the controller, right? They're just trying to run this process, which is a bit like putting a bunch of interns in a room and asking them to brainstorm. You don't really expect to get out of that some actual solution to your problem without somebody who actually knows how to run the business, or how to do research or whatever, supervising and directing things. So in principle, you should be able to train a kind of second order GPT to actually make that AutoGPT-like process work. I don't see why it wouldn't. So that's what I imagine is happening at OpenAI right now. I could be wrong, but I think there's no reason why that couldn't have emergent capabilities significantly beyond what GPT-4 on its own is possible. Is possible for it to do.
That's really, really interesting. That's super helpful. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, and as Matt says, it's not that I actually hope this is happening, but it's kind of obvious. I don't see why it wouldn't work. I mean, this collection of agents inside this bubble is something that was done for Alpha Star. So there's an idea of population-based training that was pioneered by DeepMind. It works, having a population of agents with slightly different characteristics and kind of directing them in a collective to do something. These kinds of ideas do work at scale. We know reinforcement learning works at scale. So I would say that the current RLHF training, which is reinforcement learning and based on PPO, getting this to work at scale is probably proving that this can be done with large language models seems to me like the prerequisite or the starting point for something more robust in this direction, like this GPT squared. So I think this is coming, and I think this is where AGI comes from. I don't think it's just scaling up existing language models without some sort of supervening kind of layer like this.
I also wonder if there's scope for sort of technically correct sandbagging from OpenAI on this, where they can say, no, we're not training GPT-5 right now.
That's right.
We're not training a larger model right now, and that doesn't mean that they aren't doing work that is increasing the capabilities of these systems as a whole. But I think you could technically get away with saying, well, we're not training the next large language model on an even bigger data set with more parameters and more compute. But I think that is, again, you could say that with a straight face and it would be technically correct. You would not be lying. And yet you could certainly characterize the sort of development you've put on the board here, Dan, as continuing to increase the capability of these systems on a pace that is just as frightening or concerning, and does not at all correspond to a 6-month hiatus, cease and sort of ceasefire in this arms race kind of thing. And I do wonder if that's what's going on behind the scenes. In which case, I would expect, just being cynical, that is exactly what's happening, or something directly analogous to what you've described here.
My guess would be, I don't have any insider knowledge on this, but my guess would be that both DeepMind and OpenAI have initial preliminary evidence that this works as of like end of last year or something. So yeah, I don't know, but I would guess that that's exactly what's happening. I think the insiders probably think it's fairly amusing that the open letter is focusing on not training bigger models, because from their point of view, this is not actually where the easy progress is anymore. So they will go along with that to some extent, because, maybe even from their point of view, it's convenient that to let people focus on this, because they can appear to be cooperating and be sensible and consistent with the statements they make publicly about caring about safety and so on, while actually the progress they want to make is in any case in a different direction. But this
There are a lot of
back
people
to sorry.
inside the companies. Sorry, I just wanted to add on to that. There are a lot of people inside the companies that appear to have gone in with the purposes of like worrying about safety. So I wonder if this was like, wouldn't there be like whistleblowers and stuff if this kind of thing was happening inside? Because we're talking about like a little bit of a conspiracy almost. Like if these companies are like, oh yeah, well, we expect to actually get a lot of gains from this agent architectures line of research and engineering, rather than, or in orthogonally to improving the quality of the individual components. Wouldn't we get, I don't know, maybe they're under very strict non-disclosure agreements or something like that. But it just seems like there are a bunch of people who are sort of rowdy or like not happy with the corporate incentives and stuff. So why wouldn't they be sounding the alarm if this kind of thing was actually a big threat immediately? Because this is like straight out of AI safety doom scenarios, right?
Yeah,
this is like this is not just so people are worried about GPT-4 because of its potential to eventually become something like this, but not GPT-4 itself. But this, the picture you've got on the board here is like exactly what people are worried about, and it's like explicitly trying to be that. And so, well, maybe they think that one possible answer to my question is maybe the people who work in these companies actually think that their safety measures will be able to handle this, but that doesn't make me feel very good.
Well, just to add to the concerns here, one of the things that concerns me looking at this approach is that this training approach looks decentralizable to me. In other words, training a very, like, if the only way to obtain additional emergent capability were to train GPT-5 or beyond, and that took a huge amount of centralized resources and dedicated supercomputer time and so forth, there are some significant barriers to that, and only maybe perhaps a small number of players could achieve it. But if all you need is a controller, and that's not too hugely onerous as the to run, I mean, something on the order of a modest Bitcoin mining operation, and then all you need is just an army of these GPT instances wired up in some architecture. Well, you just have a GPT-4 botnet, right? I mean, what are if you've got 100,000 strong botnet and it's just running instances of GPT on compromised computers around the world, well, then you could decentralize this. And then again, that just to feed into Matt's just sort of fears here. I mean, yeah, you could have, so in other words, you could have bad actors surreptitiously pursuing more capable systems in a way that would be much more difficult to see, or could be more, black market, gray market kind of operations and efforts than just training the next huge, big, larger iteration of the core language model itself. So yeah, that strikes me as concerning. I don't know, maybe that's silly, but silly sci-fi kind of.
You just made a very good argument for the government to regulate high token prices. If I was running one of these companies, I would use that argument to say, do not put the boundary here. Do not have very cheap tokens for very capable models so that bad guys can run the controller. No, the border needs to go like here. So inside the company where the tokens are cheap, we can actually make this work at sufficient scale, but nobody outside can do it. This is safety. True safety is the insiders that you can regulate and whose data centers you can peek into whenever you want. Safety is having those people be the only ones who can afford to, I mean, this is a lot of money, right? Running all these GPT-4s, RL is insanely expensive because it's not just you run this when you actually want to use it. The training process, to train GPT squared on RL, where you have to do it 1 million stupid times before you actually get it right, that is millions and millions and millions of tokens. For outsiders, it's prohibitive. I don't think anybody who doesn't actually have direct access to these models internally could possibly afford to train GPT squared at current prices.
Well, what about, are you thinking that the instances that can run locally, like say, the Llama and other local systems that are, they're not GPT-4, they're not that capable, but that's right now, that's today. What about 3 years from now?
Yeah, that's right.
And could you, and again, maybe without super low latency and incredible memory bandwidth and caching and so forth, you're just not going to be able to, in any reasonable time, perform the training you would need to perform in order to get good results out of this. But my concern is that I'm seeing little instances of GPT there, and I'm thinking, yeah, there could be 100,000 of those, and that they could each be a laptop or a computer, like the two that are sitting in my mom's condo or Stephanie's mom's condo, that are unsecured and full of junk and malware, and almost certainly are already compromised, sitting on botnets of various kinds. So why wouldn't they each have a local instance of GPT just spinning on them all night long, participating in this process, and then somebody's availing themselves of that. So that's, anyway, that seems to me like it's not quite so far-fetched Hollywood sort of nonsense as
I think that makes sense,
some big government black ops project or whatever, black budget project that's training secretly GPT-6 right now that nobody knows about, but it's got $1 billion budget and a building like the Oak Ridge building we've got up on the other board, secretly somewhere. So if what it took to get to the next level was a facility like that one at Oak Ridge, that would inspire me a little more, that would ease my mind a little bit. But the idea that what you've drawn on the board here might be something that you could do, a criminal organization could do, that's concerning. And again, I'm not so concerned about sort of, the capability emerging, Skynet emerging, and the whole, doomsday scenario of ASI and FOOM arising. But, if you have a system that's much more capable than GPT-4 alone, because it's all, architected and takes advantage of just not scaling, but just raw size, sheer numbers, and a bit of networking cleverness, well, then you could have the sorts of problems like misinformation and deepfakes and that kind of thing emerging that criminal organization could really take advantage of. So this just strikes me as something that's more plausibly concerning.
I think I guess it's a question of, whether this works or not is itself an emergent capability as a function of the scale of the GPT-1 that's here. I don't know if Llama is enough. Maybe a very good controller can make effective use of even quite limited models. I guess we'll find out. Regarding Matt's earlier comment, I also don't quite understand. My instincts would be along the lines of what you said. I think people like Jan Leica or others in DeepMind seem like they wouldn't be going along with this, which is why I said preliminary evidence. I think probably there are efforts somewhat along this direction. This is not what Gato is, but not too different either, right? So the next generation of Gato, conceivably, I mean, it's not it doesn't directly look like this, but this is a slight evolution of that. So I can imagine that there's preliminary evidence, which if you look at it the right way, is evidence for this, but maybe it's currently thought of in a slightly different way by insiders, and therefore they don't see it as necessarily something about which they should blow the whistle. So maybe it hasn't quite distilled out or been clarified or scaled up. So that would be my guess, is that something along these lines is happening, but maybe not so recognizably dangerous. I don't know. So yeah, I don't have a good theory as to why that is. Although one would have to say that the kerfuffle after the public release of GPT-4 was not presaged by a bunch of whistleblowers either, right? And arguably they looked at that and thought, well, I will save my whistleblowing for when really dangerous things happen. And maybe that same phenomena is happening now. But yeah, I would tend to agree. I would be surprised if there were very far along efforts in this direction already, because I would think that it's too obviously dangerous that many people would quit, like Hinton just quit. So who knows?
And haven't there been a few instances where whistleblowers sounding the alarm have been ostracized? There was the fellow at Google a year ago or so who was concerned, I think probably saw, something similar to GPT-4's capability in Google as Bard or some equivalent there early on, and raised the alarm about possible glimmers of sentience, and he was roundly criticized and mocked and ridiculed and lost his job, and it was basically pilloried for it, just tarred and feathered and made an example of, as it were. And I wonder if there's now an atmosphere of concern, like you said, Dan, where anybody who's going to blow the whistle is going to be concerned that unless it's really warranted and they're on completely firm ground, they're really going to get burned. And burn themselves in their career and their future and so forth that way. And so there may be a lot of hesitancy to blow the whistle unless there's a very high level of confidence that shenanigans.
I don't think that. I think that experience. He chose sentience and consciousness or whatever, which was, kind of strategically suicide. I mean, if you're going to blow the whistle, if you blow it in the direction of the existing concerns in the AI safety community, as Matt was saying, like this diagram here, basically raises all sorts of specific red flags to anybody who's sort of steeped in that literature. If you blow the whistle and you invoke these very specific concerns, you will pretty much immediately have a body of supporters, and potentially, your career options are not even, that much restricted. I think it would be a very different reception. Yeah. All right. I guess we need to wrap up in 5 minutes or so. Maybe let's go back to some of the other things you raised briefly, Adam. What haven't we talked about? Maybe we can pick it up next time, but we talked about the crowds of copies, decentralization. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I honestly don't know. I think it's very hard to say ahead of time, right? We have such a wide spectrum of capabilities and unknown prospects for combining them by other agents, as we're just sketching out here on the right-hand board, that how that goes and how quickly various pieces advance will seem to dictate the balance of power between decentralization and centralization. So I could see it going either way, depending on levels of investment, levels of progress, how well these second-order models work. I have to say that in terms of safety, I'd much rather it be centralized, even though that would... I think given that I'm more concerned about existential risk than you are, I guess I see the centralization of power and even economic disenfranchisement as second order concerns, frankly. I mean, I very much don't like the prospects of higher levels of inequality and even geopolitical dominance of various actors. But all of that, I kind of would much rather live in that world than the paperclip world. So I think I'd rather sacrifice all of that in order to potentially have a more centralized, safer system. But maybe that's a false dichotomy. I don't know.
Well, certainly I think experience shows us that it's easier. Well, maybe I'm being too hyperbolic here. We have instances both ways. We have instances where it's easier to regulate a consolidated industry because there aren't as many, it's not whack-a-mole with hundreds and hundreds of different entities and actors. If it's easier to keep a small number of institutions in line and regulate them and monitor them. But at the same time, if individual institutions become powerful enough, then who watches the watchers, right? Those institutions, you get a feedback loop, and those institutions can begin to capture the monitoring and regulatory agencies, and that becomes a problem as well. So yeah, it's and then of course one of the problems here is that all of this is such a rapidly moving target. That, I mean, what you regulate now isn't going to be what you regulate a year from now, or 6 months from now, or certainly not 5 or 10 years from now. And so there are major challenges for figuring out how do we proceed safely, what rules should we put in place, what are guiding principles behind any rules that are established, and so on. I'm sad that I'm missing these AI safety sessions. I know you said that they're not being recorded deliberately so, but I do feel like I'm out of the loop on that stuff. Maybe one thing that we could do in a future disruption seminar is maybe get just a quick recap of the alignment discussions that you've had, and I'd like to just kind of get a summary and a sort of lay of the land as it currently stands. From you guys on that. That would be really interesting. Maybe we could follow that up next or that could be a follow-up to this next time.
Sounds great. Yep.
Yeah, cool. I've been thinking about, I pitched to the ethics of AI folks teaching the class that I'm tutoring at Melbourne Uni. I pitched to them that I could give a lecture on the alignment problem and AI safety for our students. I don't think it's going to go ahead this year because the lecture schedule is already filled up. But maybe also next semester I'll be like giving that lecture. It could be like a good chance to practice a lecture that kind of goes over the basic case. I know that Adam, you've expressed in the past skepticism about the orthogonality thesis, if I remember right. So we could also maybe have a discussion. That's one of the kind of key points in the AI safety story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's really the linchpin of the whole thing is this and it's the big open question, and that is, is it possible to have hyper competence without fully general across all domains intelligence? And that to me is really it gets to the essence of the orthogonality thesis, which is the idea that you could have a hyper competent system that is nevertheless extremely stupid in a handful of key ways, specifically very stupid with respect to evaluating its own goals, priorities, complex value systems and structures, all of the massively, not even hierarchy, but just the massively webbed value relations, because it's hugely difficult in the real world to accomplish anything with any competence unless you have a massive number of networked and competing and contradicting and trading off values against one another for all the zillions of subtasks and sub priorities you have to set up. And so to have a system that can be hyper competent but also wants to do something super dumb like just turn things into paper clips, that you have to mount a pretty compelling argument to say that you can be smart enough to be super competent and also still be really, really dumb with respect to not knowing or being introspective or reflective about complex values and value systems. And so I'm really interested to get sort of a sense of where the technical state of the art is on that conversation.
To close the loop.
You're framing.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to say you're framing Adam's.
To add to that. Sorry. It's just kind of funny that we imagine like the super intelligence, but then it kind of also behaves like a computer, like, right? Like, it's sort of very literal in terms of understanding what we're asking it to do. It's kind of, yeah. I think that's probably what's going on.
Yeah, well, both of you, I'm so, this is something that's definitely a crux, because I'm so like put off by both of you, the way that you framed this discussion, and I have the completely opposite, very strong intuition. So,
all right, well, I'm really keen to hear that. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good for next time. Just to close the loop a bit, you expressed the skepticism about hyper-competent individuals or intelligences nonetheless pursuing very dumb ends. But we started this conversation talking about American politics, so I think you have a bit of inconsistency in your world model. All right, Thanks everybody. We'll leave it there and pick this up next time.